Good evening. Welcome to the March 5th, 2024 City of Minot Planning Commission meeting. Call the roll.
Bauman? Domes?
Present.
Bacon? Gates?
Here.
Iverson?
Here.
Kibler?
Here.
Johnson?
Here.
Minot? Offerdahl?
Here.
Pontanila?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay, with that, let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, moving on. Agenda item number 4, approval of the February regular meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
I'd move to approve. Second.
Move to approve by Commissioner Kibler, second by Commissioner Domes. Any discussion? Okay, seeing no discussion, we'll close the discussion and call the roll.
Bauman? Domes?
Yes.
Gates?
Yes.
Iverson?
Yes.
Kibler?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Offerdahl?
Yes.
Pontanila?
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, moving on to agenda item number 5, preliminary plat or major plat, Gold Nugget 7th edition. It's a public hearing request by Abraham Anderson on behalf of the property owner, Magic City MHL LLC. Property owner for the preliminary plat is to consolidate 4 outlots and unplatted portion of land into 2 lots. The proposed subdivision is to be called the Golden Nugget 7th edition. With that, we'll turn it over to city staff for findings and report.
All right, as you can see, this property is located in southeast Minot. It's actually just south of the Minot Public Works building. Here is the proposed subdivision, subdividing the property into 2 separate lots. The current zoning on the property is C2 General Commercial and MH Mobile Home District. The current development is legal, non-conforming. Any future development would have to conform to the existing underlying zoning. The subject property is designated as a manufactured home community in ag and open space in our future land use plan. Here is provided some photos of the property. This is on the left facing northwest. On the right shows a south facing 35th Street Southeast. Again, some photos on the left you have facing southeast, and on the right facing southwest. This is the riverbank and the floodplain in the area. These are the finding of fact. They can be found in staff's written report. Ultimately, the Planning Commission has the authority to recommend if the case should be approved or denied with or without conditions. Staff recommends Planning Commission adopt staff finding of fact and recommends City Council approve the major subdivision preliminary plat for Gold Nugget 7th edition. With that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Any questions for city staff?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Diedrichsen, just so you've got all these different zone properties, an ag property, a mobile home property, park designation, they're all going to be now one designation, is that it?
Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibler, yes, the designation would be C2 primarily. That is what would be left with the Lot 2. Lot 1 is actually going to be designated as flood. It's future flood buyout property. That's part of the reason why the owner is choosing to do a plat of this property, is they've identified the area that will likely be part of flood control in the future, and so they're separating.
Okay,
off a
so,
future
so
flood
that, is
buyout.
that like the hazard mitigation zone
So that
gonna
would-
buy that out sort of thing, or?
Yeah, that, it's part of all of the flood
Okay.
control properties. I can't tell you the
I don't know who's
specifics
settled
on
by
that.
it.
We'd have to go to Public Works and defer to Public Works for the specifics on it. I just know that it's designated as a future flood control property.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for city staff? Okay, seeing none, we'll open the public hearing. Is there anybody in attendance that wishes to speak on behalf of this agenda item? Is there anybody that wishes to speak in opposition of this agenda item? Anybody wish to speak for or against this agenda item? All right, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing and we'll turn it over to commissioners for a motion.
Move the adoption of the recommendation.
Motion to approve by Commissioner Kibler.
Don't.
I'm Downs, sorry.
Yeah, I'll second it.
Okay, second by Commissioner Kibler, my apologies. Any discussion? Any discussion? Okay. seeing
Yeah,
none-
I do have just one question. Was this a necessary move then to replat this land to separate out the hazard mitigation or the flood control portion from the other outlot?
Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibler, I don't think that it was necessary, like.
Yeah,
they
was it
weren't
necessary to-
Forced upon them or anything, but they do know that in the future, likely this property will be part of an eminent domain case, and so they're getting out ahead of it, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll call the roll.
Gomes.
Yes.
Gates.
Yes.
Iverson.
Yes.
Kibler.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Offerdahl.
Yes.
And Pontanila.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, moving on to agenda item number 6, other business.
So I guess with the permission of the chair, our associate planner, Mr. Dan Falconer, has prepared a short presentation of some research that he's done regarding parking minimums. He looked at some communities that were identified in our comprehensive plan as being comparable cities. And he was looking to present his findings from his research to the Planning Commission.
Okay.
One second, Mr. Chairman. It sounds like somebody joined us on Teams. Did someone join us on Teams?
Looks like.
I believe it's Commissioner Baumann.
Yep, this is Tim. I apologize for the delay. I was able to make it in. Thanks, Mr. Billingsley.
No problem.
All right. Today I'd like to talk about parking minimums. Go to the next slide. That you controlling? Okay. Parking minimums, simply put, are just the minimum amount of parking. Oh, yeah, sure. Let me. There you go. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So, simply put, parking minimums are the minimum amount of parking that we dictate in our code per use of a parcel. So, for example, I have here a medical clinic must provide 2 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of building. They can be found in our Land Development Ordinance, Article 6, and they are set by us and amended by us as well. Next. These are really a consequence of our autocentric culture. As the automobile became more and more widespread, it is now assumed that the places we go will have a place for our car. And as a consequence, now we have moved that cost of that parking onto the developer as they build their projects. Next slide, please. And so I've taken this picture from the comprehensive plan, and this is a picture of downtown. You can see the yellow areas are parking lots. And from our community survey, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, we have too many parking lots everywhere. So is there something Minot could do better? Are we average? And so that was the point of my research, was to figure out where we are and where we might want to go. It was mostly just a fact-finding adventure. And one of the first things I found was in 2021, Minot reduced its parking standards. And so I think it's too early to know if these parking standards, being only 3 years old now, and most of the developments not being of that older age, it's probably too soon to really know, but I still compared us to the 5 other cities in our comprehensive plan. That would be Rapid City, South Dakota, Grand Forks, North Dakota, Great Falls, Montana, and Manhattan, Kansas, and La Crosse, Wisconsin as comparable cities. And I wanted to know where we are now right after we have reduced our standards. And then I also compared us before. And then to show a more regional or national level, I found a comprehensive list from 2002 of several cities. Next slide. I'll start with the parking exemptions. These are broad carve-outs that don't have any kind of parking regulation. And I wanted to draw attention to how most of these towns all have their central business district carved out as parking minimum free. You can see that for Minot, Rapid City, Grand Forks has a special carve-out, Great Falls, La Crosse, and Manhattan. Grand Forks and Minot are somewhat unique. La Crosse also has something similar where they have an alternative where if you jump through the right hoops, you won't have a minimum, or you can have a greatly reduced minimum. And that allows for flexibility with developments. Next slide, please. Just to quickly go into what Minot has as alternatives, I'm not going to quote the code or anything like that, but I just would like everyone to know that Minot has alternatives already in place with this new reduction that we can administratively approve a 20% plus or minus. And then if that isn't going to work, we can also go into alternative strategies. Shared parking is simply tenants of a mall could band together and all their parking could be that one big parking lot you see in the mall. Standalone parking is off-lot parking that is close enough to still count. I think it has to be within 300 feet. Transport demand management is demonstrating through modeling that the amount of spaces that they want are adequate. Demonstrated parking is for chains where, let's say, a new Menards comes. The Menards knows how many spaces they have and how much they use regionally, so they have a pretty good idea already starting. And then avoidance of sensitive resources. We don't want people paving over wetlands and things just for a parking lot. And then at the end, we just have alternative reduction strategies that can be approved by planning and engineering. That can be anything that these are or a combination thereof. So to reiterate, removing parking requirements for downtown has been the most popular motion by the municipalities studied. Currently, Minot Central Business District has been exempt, and I went all the way back to the first ordinance I could find, which was 1959, where it was exempt there as well. And so we have, in essence, a little mini experiment where we already have a spot where we don't try to tell people how much parking to have. And so with these coming slides, there's going to be a lot of information, and I am just going to highlight the 30,000-foot view from these. And so these are the 5 cities that Minot is being compared with on our comprehensive plan. And you can see here that they're all pretty standard in terms of housing. Next slide. And then as we get into each use, I was only able to compare categories where the definitions were exactly the same. The definitions are not standard definitions. One person's idea of a bank is not the same as another person's idea of a bank. And so I'd like to draw attention to the bar graphs below. And you'll see that Minot is in the lower category of required parking for both medical clinic and bowling alleys. And then with daycares, they're all pretty much the same there, and the bank as well, we are in the below average. And so moving from this kind of comparison, you can see that Minot is nowhere near the top of some of these categories. And so then as we move nationally, next slide, please. You can see that, and these are just a random pick from anywhere I could get information of a category that was defined similarly. So you can see the orange bars there are the averages. I have Minot circled. You can see for daycares, they are basically average. For banks, they are below average. For bowling alleys, they're below average. For medical clinics, they're also below average. And so this is where we stand today, and I was curious to know, and so I went back in the old code to about, I believe it was 2021, like I had said, and I included that in the next slide. And you can see here that for daycare centers, it didn't really change much. For banks, we were a little bit above average. For bowling alleys, we were above average. And for clinics, we were above average. And so you can see our drop from that hashed bar down to the solid. And so we have cut down pretty significantly already. And like I said, these regulations, they're only about 3 years old. And so going forward, just to keep in mind that the majority of the buildings we see in town now are going to be of the old regulations. Next slide, please. And like I said, this analysis is difficult just because, like I said, the definitions are not universally shared. The buildings are from different towns where there are different styles and needs, and also local demands could be different. And then, as I said before, they were just lowered. And then a few other things to consider is in North Dakota, with the inherent lack of density that we have in our towns, it is very auto-centric. And so we have this large trade area of people who will come here to shop, and the only way that they're going to be able to get here is by car. There's no trains or buses or anything that's going to be able to get them here. Next. And I'd also like to draw our attention to the commuters. And so you see that arrow on the left, 11,458 people are going to drive into town. And so they will need a spot, as well as the 14,921 that stay in the city. 84% of those are going to be driving alone. And so here is where you kind of see the extent of the auto-centric nature of town. You see that walking and public transportation and carpooling do have representations, they'll be at very low. And this is kind of where the inertia or the way that we want to approach this is, right now it is very car dominated, whereas I think it would be worthwhile to think about how we could maybe try to nudge this in a more walkable, bikeable area, but as it stands right now, that is the picture we have. Next slide, please. And so we do need to keep those people that come to our town in mind as well. We can't just start reducing, but we can also, I believe, start to work on those commuters within town, the 14,000 or so that were quoted as staying in town are, I believe, a good target to start to try to nudge in the direction of public transit. And so It's okay, you can go to the next slide. And so just a final summary, we very recently reduced our parking standards. Compared to other cities, Minot is average to below average in terms of parking requirements. We have some unique aspects that we need to consider as well besides just what we want to do as a city. And unfortunately, it's not just as simple as yes or no. And so, next slide, I proposed some steps or things that we could discuss tonight, if everyone would like to. We could try to look for pinch points in our parking policy. Where's the frustration with our lack of parking? I am not aware of any stalled development potential that could be swayed by reducing parking requirements, but I'd love to hear any evidence to the contrary. Like La Crosse, Wisconsin did, they just did a blanket removal on, say, industrial sites where, you know, they, I believe, could be tasked with doing their own parking as their factories and things wouldn't work if their workers couldn't find a place to go. So I feel like there is wiggle room here. We just have to decide what our risk aversion is and how we want to go about it. Anyway, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you. Very good presentation too, by the way.
Thank you.
Any questions for city staff?
This is Commissioner Bauman. I have a question for Mr. Falconer, but I can wait too if someone else needs to jump in.
Mr. Chairman, is the time for questions separate from discussion, or is it synonymous?
Yeah, discussion questions.
Yeah, I guess I've asked several people about parking in Minot, and I've got a very mixed message from everybody. And my own sense, if I owned a business, I would want to ensure, like a standalone business, I would want to make sure that there was sufficient parking for my customers. If I'm in the Renaissance Zone downtown, don't we have 2 parking lots there that are underutilized now? Aren't people complaining that we've built these 2 parking garages that I think the bus terminal is going to move into one of them because they're not utilized? And yet we imagine a future where if we have a bustling downtown, these parking garages would fill up. Is that part of what people are imagining, that we optimally use the parking garages for a walking population downtown?
The parking, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Kibler, the parking garages were initially proposed by a developer who was going to build 5-story buildings above the ramps. And as we all know, that never worked out. We are working with a company right now to build a 5-story building above the central ramp. Renaissance Zone ramp is still open at this time, but those ramps were really intended for, the parking was really intended for the users of those 2 buildings.
So the intention is to get those garages used by building up, in one instance, on top of them?
Correct.
Okay. I guess if I had a retail business on Main Street, I obviously couldn't put a parking lot there. I did bring up that issue of parking meters, and I know everyone knows that in North Dakota it's illegal, but that's been challenged a couple times too, or at least groups have threatened to put parking meters in. And I guess maybe that's my larger question, is that there are really different realities, parking realities. One would be a downtown reality. One, to my mind, would be a standalone business reality. And then I think if you're providing housing, that reasonable idea that you would provide parking for your residents in those housing also seems kind of an even separate sort of reality that we'd have to discuss in terms of parking. If we want to have a downtown that trains people to walk in it, and we don't have people inclined to walk now, so it would have to be a long process to get people into a walking mindset. I think that would be a very positive thing. And that's all I'd
Chairman
say.
Alfadal, Commissioner Kibler. Yeah, I'd like to speak to that. So there's There is that, and that's what I was trying to convey when I was talking about that inertia and that trying to get the ball over the hill kind of thing. So, and I feel like there has to be that first before these kinds of things can come into play. And I'd also like to say one thing about parking minimums is that just because we don't regulate it anymore doesn't mean that the developers aren't acutely aware of what they need to do to make their development succeed. And so this could be seen through the lens of less government. We just don't tell them a number. They would have to do the math themselves. And with our parking alternatives, we have opened up an avenue if they so choose to use it right now, but they can also just go straight to our parking table, which is what most of them do.
I guess I like the trend away from minimums, especially for downtown. And other places, businesses are only smart to provide enough parking, particularly for standalones, that would accommodate their business.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Kibler, right now, we do not have any parking minimums in our downtown.
Yeah.
So the only zone in our city that does not have any minimum parking requirements at this time.
And is the hope of our discussion to move towards getting some minimums? That's
Nope.
what I.
No, the discussion, Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibler, is to discuss what we'd like to do with them. Like, do we want them to go away? Because there is a very popular movement right now to get rid of parking minimums and let the markets decide what they want to do. There are people that are afraid that that'll lead to ripple effects of people taking other people's parking, and so it's where I guess it's where the risk tolerance comes in. And there are ways to do like a staggered or a metered approach, and so that's what we'd like to talk about tonight.
If I may, Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibler, there are places in the city where there have been issues with the lack of parking available. Specifically, you look at our strip development areas, such as Broadway. If a business decides not to provide enough parking or adequate parking, you will see that parking spill over into the adjacent residential neighborhoods, and that's where we run into problems. That's why these parking minimums are there, not for downtown or the mall and Best Buy. They're building plenty of parking. They know what they need to do over in those big lots over there. It's the areas along our strips, our main drags, where property is expensive and space is at a premium and you want as much square footage in your building as you can, where parking can see a lack of sufficient numbers being created, and then it spills over into the neighborhood. And that's when we start, as the city, starting receiving calls of nuisance complaints. Why is there 30 cars parked along the front of my house? I can't get into my own driveway, and I can't park my own car in front of my house. And that's where the nuisance comes into play. It's not our downtowns and our malls and our big box stores that are located in the mall parking lot and places like that. It's along Broadway.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Diedrichson, this is actually the discussion I had, because several years ago now there was a commission attempting to study whether or not we could expand the green space on Broadway. And retail owners were absolutely against it. And we were kind of appalled at the time, thinking, well, beautification helps everybody, but at the expense of parking or even additional labor that they would have to take on to maintain beautified spaces, there was a general business sense that they didn't want to spend the money or dedicate any green space that might be parking space or big box space or retail space. So that's the argument that I've had with people. Some people, I've thought, business owners are going to just want to fob it onto the city in some way. And others have told me, no, smart business owners will want to make sure there's enough parking for their business, particularly for standalones. Broadway, what are you going to do? All of Broadway's trouble for access and everything else. I mean, can you have more trouble than Broadway?
Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibler, I don't think that there's any doubt in anyone's mind that some of the most expensive space in the city of Minot is adjacent to Broadway. Just the absolute number of trips up and down that road. Every resident of Minot drives down Broadway. You know, it's the primary north-south corridor, and Burdick Expressway is our primary east-west, and a couple of other major east-west corridors. And that's where land is expensive, and providing parking is expensive. Transit-oriented development and multimodal transportation, as Dan had mentioned, getting that ball over the hill can help considerably with those demands. We've made great strides in providing dedicated bike lanes and bike routes and adding sidewalk requirements for development. As someone who was previously a multimodal transportation planner in their career, I'm very excited about the shared multi-use paths that are being incorporated into our flood control areas. We're about to have a major east-west corridor that isn't auto-centric through our city. When those flood controls are done, you're going to be able to ride a bike and walk from the east side of town to the west side of town and back. We may find businesses that get on to that, and can I reduce my parking because I am directly adjacent to the walking trail and the multi-use trail, or I'm directly adjacent to a transit route, and we will see expansion in transit availability. We are changing from a rural transit system to an urban transit system. Different funding sources, different availability of resources from the federal level associated with our achieving metropolitan status. So there are other things moving forward to be excited about that could, as Dan mentioned, get that ball up and over the hill. Right now, as he had mentioned, the new parking minimums are fairly fresh. Downtown is no parking required. We've reduced greatly the number of parking spaces required in other districts. But I guess the question we're posing to you is have we done enough? Are there other areas that we should be looking at? He mentioned the example of industrial zones. Do we need to tell a factory owner how many parking spots they need for their employees to come to work? That's a question for this commission to answer, and through research, look at and see where you land.
Commissioner, Mr. Diedrichsen, I guess on one level, a discussion is all theoretical, because we don't have that zone or that retail or the industrial business owner who's building a parking lot and making a request, so we can only imagine what they would and what they would not do. It does seem reasonable that people are going to provide the parking that they think they need for their people and for their prosperity. And if we don't have minimums downtown, and we've already got some good guidelines everywhere, it seems like we're doing pretty well. Is there like a crux or some issue? And Broadway, great, we've got all the bicycles and all the parking, all that. You're still not going to be able to make a left-hand turn on Broadway for all of that. And I know Dana Larson says we've got to use more access roads and not the main drag. But that problem, it seems to be precedes a parking problem with what goes on in Broadway.
There are other issues, Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Kibble, associated with sprawling strip-style development that became popular with the auto-centric society we live in. Space, again, is at a premium. So we don't do transportation planning, but I will tell you, again, we have achieved metropolitan status. I'm sure you've heard of the creation of our new metropolitan planning organization. And that organization will be solely focused on transportation planning and creating a transportation network that not only works for Minot, but for the greater metropolitan region overall. So hopefully we might see some good planning initiatives come out of that organization once it's up and running that can address some of those issues.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Diedrichson, I think that's the most exciting thing I've heard. You know, I guess I've lived here 24 years, and people told me there was a bus service in town, and it took me a couple years before I actually, saw one of them. And I think if we've got metropolitan status and yet a kind of fixed infrastructure, it'd be very exciting to see what we can do to benefit mass transit for people who would like to do without a car or who don't have a car, and keep those cars parked for those who want to ride, or subway or light rail or any of the things that probably are not coming, but might one day be here. And that's all I have to say.
Reminder, Chairman Offerdahl, Commissioner Baumann was looking to make some statements, ask questions.
The floor is yours, Vice Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Offerdahl. I really appreciate that. I just want to start out, first of all, by saying, Mr. Falconer, thanks so much for the presentation. It was really cool to see the comparison with other communities, and I know that that is not easy info to access, so kudos to you. Great presentation, and I really appreciate that. I also, just want to point out and maybe kind of reframe and recenter the conversation. It's really important to note that some of those benefits of active transit, of green space development, are really cool elements of our community. But I just want to once again refocus that the point of this conversation, or bringing the conversation up, was really about the concept of a parking spot is the most wasted, ineffective use of 3 feet by 8 feet in our community. When we look at in terms of what squares or what city blocks generate income, a parking lot will generate zero income, whereas a business or a square full of businesses will generate taxable income and drive our economy and our budget forward. And so this is really about efficient use of space within our community and making sure that we're not putting up barriers to a really thriving, vibrant economic Minot. And so that's kind of the point of this. All of those other things are great benefits, but they are definitely secondary to the fact that if we build for cars, we will get cars. And if we build for people, we will get people. And I really appreciate the thoroughness of Mr. Falconer's presentation. And as someone who brought this up with the concept of looking at removing parking minimums as a whole and just kind of carte blanche and letting the market dictate things, I feel like Mr. Falconer and I would assume Mr. Diedrichson and Mr. Billingsley, I don't get the sense that the Minot community is ready for that for a variety of reasons, either because of habit or because of the fact that we do have so many car-centric people who need their car to get to Minot, period. And I really appreciated that point of just the people commuting in, the people commuting out, the broad area that we serve. Really does lend itself to the fact that there will need to be spaces for cars. But I do love the idea of maybe a surgical approach to reducing parking minimums where we can. And I guess my thought moving forward, and I would, love feedback from my colleagues, I think I'm leaning towards let's use this chance in this discussion to go in with a scalpel and let the professionals who we've hired to be our planner and economic development coordinator and assistant planner tell us if there are areas where our code right now is too generous or too onerous to developers. And maybe there are places where we can, just go in and really surgically address where we don't need to have parking. And maybe that would include, reducing some, if there are ways we can kind of scale back some of the multi-unit residential units, I would love to see that. Again, just knowing that apartments get people here who spend money and support our economy. A parking space is not a place to live. It's not a place to do business. It's not a place to thrive. It's just a space to put a car for 1 hour every 3 days. And so wanting to just be smart about that process. I'm leaning more towards, asking our professionals to do their work and give us some recommendations on if there's ways we can scale back parking without necessarily throwing the whole thing out.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that seems like a quite reasonable idea. Let the professionals make recommendations.
I would agree. Any other discussion? Do we have the manpower and hours to do something like this? What's our workload? I don't know your workload. so-
Mr. Chairman, we typically do one major cleanup every fall. So that would give staff enough time to look at the code and come back to the commission with possibly maybe some changes in the fall, okay? But as of right now, we don't have the manpower to do it right away.
Absolutely. Okay. Any further discussion?
So Commissioner Offerdahl, if there isn't further discussion, I would offer a motion to consider, but I want to give the floor for anyone else who has things to say.
Absolutely. We can entertain a motion.
Yeah, I'd like to go ahead and move to direct staff to put together some recommended reductions to parking minimums across the community, all zones, all uses, and find what they feel is most professional in their opinion for reducing parking minimums in any way that we can. And then I should also add that that would be probably presented with the fall language cleanup.
Yeah, I'll second it.
Any discussion?
Mr. Chair, if I may ask for clarification, generally we do the fall cleanup in November. Would you want us to bring those recommendations to the Planning Commission in October for your review before we bring it formally in an application form in November? And that's just a question. In general, for the planning commissioners, would you like to see our recommendations the month before we actually bring an application? Would you like to set up a similar presentation as we did tonight? Kind of, this is the research that we did, these are the zones we decided we could target, this is why we came to these conclusions. I feel like we could go much further in depth at that point, and then if there were any changes that you as planning commissioners wanted to make, we could make those prior to bringing in a formal zoning ordinance modification application to you.
Okay, one quick question before I ask Tim to amend his motion. Timeline again, is that feasible for city staff? Okay. Would you be willing to amend your motion there, Mr. Baumann?
Yep, absolutely. I'd love to see that presentation, I think for all of our sakes and for the community, to make sure we all have a clear picture of what we're going into for the November official permit application, or change application, I should say.
I'm in.
And you're,
Yes, I'll
Okay.
second.
so we've got a motion by Commissioner Baumann and a second by Commissioner Kibler. Any further discussion? Okay, with that, call to roll.
Baumann?
Yes.
Gomes?
Yes.
Gates?
Yes.
Iverson?
Yes.
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Offerdahl?
Yes.
And Pontenila?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, motion carries. Great discussion. Any other business that we did add? That might not have-
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce Hannah Hornberger. She is our new planning and code enforcement assistant. She'll be serving as the clerk for the planning commission, taking roll call and minutes. And this is her first meeting, so welcome aboard.
Welcome, Hannah. All right, any other business?
So are we expecting to get agendas from you in the future, or? Okay.
Perfect. Anything else? All right, seeing none. Agenda item number 7, adjournment. Meeting's adjourned.